welcome to everyone for joining today's class, which is in continuation of the SCCM course, which we're actually undergoing. And yesterday we had the opportunity to be able to have an overview of what SCCM is all about, to be able to look at histories concerning SCCM. We're able to look at functionalities that comes with a new name, which is actually attached to SCCM, which we refer to as Microsoft Endpoint Manager, Configuration Manager, which Configuration Manager is actually now part of the family of a combination of other solutions like Microsoft Intune, like Desktop Analytical, like Autopiloting, and we have a kind of a tool regarding SCCM environments. So today we're going to be moving further to understand two things. Number one, what we regard to as sites and site roles. What I mean is that we're going to be looking at all the sites that exist within SCCM. And when I mean the kind of site, I'm trying to look at the kind of design that comes with SCCM. What am I saying about that again? I'm trying to tell you about the kind of topology, the kind of design you can have based on your business demands or based on the architecture that you have within your business organization. And we're going to be looking at understanding the kind of logs that exist within SCCM. So what we've done today and what we're going to be doing today is going to be more of theoretical for us to understand the SCCM perimeter that we're going to be working on. So going forward from the next class, we're going to be strictly on hands-on because by then we would have a comprehensive understanding of the SCCM environment. We understand the do and don'ts. We understand what each of the categories that exist within SCCM, what they do, and how we can also extend the service into the cloud. Now, even though there's still a kind of limitations in what we're going to be doing because of, the core curriculum for this program, but we'll ensure that we cover as much as possible that is going to give you a full understanding or full appreciation of what SCCM environment is all about. And when you talk to people or you're trying to work, you know what exactly you want to work on. So I'll try as much as possible to cover every aspect that is going to be needed for you to be able to say you're bold enough to be able to take job responsibilities, within SCCM and to be able to work within the required capacity, by any organization. So like I said, before we moved into today's business, I will want to ask if you guys have any question concerning what we discussed yesterday. But if there's none, then we have to proceed into talking about sites and site roles alongside with logs that we're going to be covering today. So the floor is open for a minute or two if there's any questions whatsoever before we proceed.
Oh yeah, no question from my side.
Thank you very much, Tazin. Okay, silence is golden. So I believe that you guys understood all we discussed yesterday. And I also believe that you've had the opportunity to be able to go through the videos again, to be able to recap some of the things we discussed and to be able to fill the gap concerning what exactly you might be missing. And like what I said yesterday, is that you guys should try as much as possible to keep yourself up to date regarding the SCCM class. It is something very, very important, a kind of a unique skill, which I will advise everybody, to try as much as possible to cover as much as they can and to be able to follow the class from start to finish. Now, when we're talking about the kind of site or the kind of topology, the kind of architecture that exists within SCCM that you could leverage in any business organization, with respect to their organizational goals or line of business, we're going to be looking at 3 sites that exist within that framework of SCCM. One of the configuration or the sites we're going to be looking at is what we call a central administration site. Okay, and after that, we're going to be looking at what we refer to as the primary site. Then we're going to be looking at what we refer to as the secondary site. These are the 3 main sites that exist within SCCM. Now, like I told you guys yesterday, try as much as possible to listen. Some of these, what I'm going to be saying, will be coming out in your exams if you decide to take a Microsoft SCCM exam. But it seems there's none as of now. The one they have initially seems to have been outdated and none has been out for now. So just in case Microsoft decides to create a role-based specialization exam relating to either SCCM or relating to endpoint manager configuration, you guys will be able to take exams to get into that. And also, like I told you guys, I'll be sending you interview questions, and some of the questions always circle around what are we going to be discussed. That we started discussing this yesterday, and we're going to proceed with it based on the schedules which we have for our training. So those are the three main sites that exist, like I said, within SCCM environment. And we're going to be taking each one of these sites and see how it transposes into the kind of configuration that you might be working on, either within your lab or within the office premises, or what is expected just in case you find yourself engaged in conversations with other IT professionals. First and foremost, like I said, we're going to be looking at what we call the central administrative site. When we say central administrative site, what exactly are we talking about? A central administrative site is a site within SCCM that exists when you have more than one primary site. Now, I'll still be going into what primary site is all about and all, but I'm going to take it up from the cap because according to hierarchy, the first thing that starts when it comes to, hierarchy within SCCM is when we're talking about the central administrative site. A central administrative site, like I said, it exists when you have more than one primary site. This alone tells you that a central administrative site, which is also known as CAS as an acronym, is that it is optional within the SCCM hierarchy, meaning that it's not a must you have it if you have only one primary site. It comes to being when you have two primary sites, okay? And it is also required when you need to manage more than 150,000 devices. I told you guys yesterday, I said, taking an example, it will be unreasonable for you to say you want to install an application within a corporate entity, within an entity, and you have to go around where you have thousands, or hundreds of devices, and you have to move from one location to the other to have it all deployed. It is non-professional, it is not standard, it is not acceptable, within any corporate entity, right? So the best thing is for you to have a solution that streamlines that entire process, that make it much more easier for everyone to be able to get a required software that is either made mandatory or something that is made to be available for people to be able to download. Okay, so when we're talking about the CAS, which is the central administrative site, it's come to existence where you have to install it when you have to manage over 150,000 devices. Okay, like I said initially, it exists when you have more than one primary site, because it is with the central administrative site that you can be able to manage all the primary sites that exist within your organization. Now, these central administrative sites can support up to 25. When we talked about child primary site, meaning that you can have 25 primary sites and everything is going to be managed within the central administrative site. What am I saying? A primary administrative site is enough to take care of a site. Another site can also, or another region can also be managed with a primary site, but you can bring all the devices together. And this comes into being when you're trying to say, for the Americas, for example, and when I say Americas, I'm talking about in the likes of Canada, in the likes of US, in the likes of Mexico, and every country within the Americas generally. And you want to also categorize all the systems that exist within Europe. You want all the systems that exist within Africa. You want all systems that exist within the Russian region. You want each one of them because of the number of devices which they manage, to stand on its own and have its own primary site. Now, like I said, the devices have to be more than 150,000. So imagine that Americas has over have 150,000 devices on its own, or it has 90,000 devices. And you have Africa, which comprises of Nigeria, Cameroon, Ghana, Mauritius, Seychelles, and all what have you, also have a devices of over 100,000 or less. Now, if you looked at it, you'll realize that, the numbers of devices in existence in terms of the corporate is more than 150,000. It means that what you're trying to do is to ensure that every entity, meaning that every region, being able to manage within its own environment, and the primary site can be linked up together and managed, within the umbrella of the central administrative site. Okay, so which means that you can have as many sites as possible, and the limitation is 25 in terms of the primary sites. Okay, in general, a central administrative site can manage 700,000 devices, meaning that if I work for an organization and the total number of devices within the organization is 700,000, I can manage every one of them within SCCM, meaning that I can create an application and distribute to 700,000 devices or less than 700,000 devices. I can patch machines up to 700,000 within a corporate entity without leaving where I'm sitting down, meaning that I can have access to all these machines within the comfort of the SCCM environment, and I can have each of those systems to be compliant to what we're looking for. Now, for this to come into existence, it means that a central administrative site also require you to have what we call a SQL server, database, for it to be able to store every devices, every users, every groups within the SCCM environment. Now, one thing that you need to know that might come up in your interview or in conversations when you're discussing with people that should be aware of is that a central administrative site does not support what we refer to as client assignment. Which, when I mean client assignment, I'm saying that clients cannot be assigned. You are not assigning anything to clients. You are not assigning clients within the central administrative site, or you don't do that as well within the what we regards to as the secondary site. You only do client assignments on the primary site. Now, this central administrative site can be installed on any Windows server, meaning either Windows Server 2008 R2, Windows Server 2012, 2012 R2, Windows Server 2016, or Windows Server 2019. You can install or any server operating system. Now, with this attribute I've already mentioned to you, just in case you've been asked at any point in time, that at what case scenario do you need to have a central administrative site, you can now be able to tell them, all what I've mentioned, earlier, because those kind of attributes or those kind of functionalities is what determines where you need to have a central administrative site to come to be within the SCCM terrain. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is we want to talk about the primary site. For SCCM to be functional, regardless of anything, you need a primary site. Okay, it is a mandatory site within the configuration manager. Like I said, the central administrative site is not mandatory, it is optional. But the primary site is mandatory, which means that for SCCM to come to being, for configuration manager to be installed or come to existence, you need a primary site for you to be able to manage both devices, users within your corporate entity. Now, one primary site can support up to 150,000 devices, which means that if your organization have devices up to 150,000, they can be supported with the primary site without the need for a central administrative site. Now the kind of architecture or the kind of location which you have within your organization will now determine if there's a need to have a secondary site. Okay, but now I'm talking about a primary site, and I said that a primary site can support up to 150 devices within your organization without the need to set up a central administrative site. Okay, now a primary site works well in a well-connected network, meaning that I have my subnets, I have my Active Directory as a whole. I can be able to retrieve information with the help of the Active Directory schema that is installed. And Active Directory schema for you, you can be able to install Active Directory schema with an application that comes with SCCM itself, which you have to run on your domain controller. So when you run it on your domain controller, it's going to create that schema, that space, that container within the Active Directory to be able to store information relating to SCCM, within your Active Directory environment. Okay, and this requires you to have a SQL Server database. Okay, so because what always happens is that there are three things that you need to consider when setting up SCCM. Number one is that you need an Active Directory, which is going to be having a registration for all your objects, which includes your devices, your users, the kind of security mechanisms in terms of security groups and what have you. And you also be looking at you having a SQL database that is going to be storing every information within SCCM. Now, SCCM itself does not just pick devices from the cloud. It picks from anywhere, if I should put it like that. It picks information from the Active Directory. Now, one thing again is that it can get information from the cloud when you have Intune integrated into your SCCM environment, which is the reason why I told you guys that right from 2019, we have what we call the Endpoint Manager, Configuration Manager, okay, which has integration of the cloud services embedded into it. Okay, this primary site also supports what we call replication of data, to the central administrative site if it is part of hierarchy. And what am I saying? I told you guys, I said the central administrative site supports more than one primary site. Now, when you have more than one site, devices in one of the sites can communicate with devices in the other site. How does this come into existence? It means that there must be a replication at some point that picks from the primary site into the central administrative site, and these happen across all primary sites. And unanimously, you can be able to get within the database of the central administrative sites all the content that exists from all the primary sites or the secondary site that exists within your organization. Now, what I just said now will give birth to what I just mentioned as a secondary site. But before I go into that, I want you to also know that primary sites can only be installed on a Windows Server operating system. Now, let's go into a secondary site. Why do we need a secondary site? At what point do we think it is important for organizations to have a secondary site? A secondary site is optional in SCCM hierarchy, just the same way central administrative site is optional. The only mandatory site in SCCM is the primary site. Okay, a secondary site comes into existence where you have other branch offices with a poor connectivity or other sites that is in a remote area. Okay, this can be only come into existence if we have a primary site. Now, which means that if a primary site does not exist, a secondary site does not exist as well. Okay, it means that a secondary site is depending on the primary site before it can come into existence, which means that it needs to connect and get fed from the primary site. Okay, so like I said in CAP, is that if there is no primary site, there is no secondary site. Now, I told you that a central administrative site can support up to 700,000 devices. And I also say that a primary site can support up to 50,000 devices. But a secondary site can support only up to 5,000 devices, okay? So which means that when it is more than 5,000 devices, you need to spin up another secondary site within that location. If it is used to manage devices, you can use this to manage devices, like I said, in a remote area, okay? Which means that areas that have a controlled bandwidth utilization or network bandwidth. Now, you will better understand that there are some locations that does not have a real broadband. Broadband, as we all know, as kind of connectivity you may have within, the urban area. Some of the sites within the rural area might actually be using what we refer to as satellites, which work with circuits and have limited bandwidth in terms of the throughput, and in terms of the throughput, which means the uplink and the downlink, they don't have much Mbps that runs in between. So as such, there might be a kind of a constraint on the bandwidth utilization. Now, another good thing about a secondary site coming into existence when you have branch offices in different locations. Taking an example, you have head office in Toronto, and you have branch offices, say, you have one branch office in Mexico, you have one branch office in Las Vegas. Now, even when you have your SD-WAN configured or you have your WAN through MPLS configured, you will realize in terms of speed of transfer of data from one location to the other that it will take more time, for data to be able to get to that destination. Sometimes you don't get to know these until when you run a ping command to see, in terms of the milli per second, how long it takes for the data, in terms for you to be able to echo and be able to check if a particular IP address is in existence. Now, what you want to do, or the benefit of you having a secondary site on a remote location, is that you want every node, and when I mean nodes, I've used this term before in our previous classes, when we're doing our Copter Plus, when we're doing a network, that when you say node, you're talking about devices. A node can either be a printer, a node can be a computer, a node can be any devices, okay? It's just a way of qualifying devices. Now, nodes within organizations needs to download information. If they need to communicate with the head office, which is in Toronto, from Las Vegas, imagine the duration it takes. You might not notice, but it takes it longer, from the back end in terms of duration for system say in London, Ontario, to get information from Toronto compared to how long it takes the system from Las Vegas to get information from Toronto. So now, for you to be able to eliminate all those factors when it comes to bandwidth utilization and all, you want a situation whereby you can be able to have a secondary site that feeds all the nodes within its own region or within its own area, so that they don't need to communicate with a system outside their own perimeter, in terms of outside their own subnet. Okay, so when you have these, you have a better control of which storage each of these nodes communicate to get their information. Now, one thing is this: any information you are configuring within a primary site is then distributed to your secondary sites. And when this content gets to this distributed secondary site, this is from there that each of the nodes, like I said, all of them get feed from, meaning that the secondary site serves as the feeder for every devices that exists within its own subnet, okay, or within its geographical area. Now, a secondary site server can be installed, also on a server application, and a server operating system, and I'll be giving you a kind of scenarios for you to understand in detail what I'm trying to talk about. So taking an example, and I will take it bit by bit for you to understand. So I will start from ground up, so from down up, meaning that I will be starting from you having a secondary site and a primary site, and we linked it up to a central administrative site. So what I'm saying is this: taking an example, I set up an organization in Toronto, okay? And in Toronto office, we have, say, like 60,000 devices. And we see that there's a need for us to expand in terms of our offices, in terms of our devices. And we decide to open office at what's it called? Say Alberta, which is still within, right? And we have we're expecting, or we already have like 20,000 devices, okay, in Alberta. Now look at that proximity. You won't want systems in Alberta downloading content from Toronto. You want a situation whereby you can have a kind of a storage, a data warehouse in Alberta, where these 20,000 devices can get content from. But the main instructions still come from the primary sites. Now, all you need to do to be able to cater for devices in Alberta is for you to have a secondary site existing in Alberta, which means that I'm having a secondary site, but the 20,000 is even more, when it comes to a secondary site, which means that I can set up like 4 secondary sites in Alberta, meaning that the one secondary site will take care of 5,000, the other one will take care of 5,000. So you have to be mindful of the constraints that exist in terms of the number of devices. Now, all these 4 secondary sites will be getting information from the primary site, which is in Toronto. So all I need to do is that in terms of the main instructions, it comes from Toronto. But when it comes to the content that they will be working with in those sites, it will be existing within their own secondary site server. Sometimes organizations don't configure a secondary site server; they configure what we call as a site server, and we're going to be talking about that, as we move on. Now, so each of these secondary site server, we have its own distribution points. We have its own site server existing within, and we have its own software update, because always know that two things, which is a major priority. Number one is that you want each of the devices within your organization to be able to get approved softwares or optional softwares, which they can install on their computer. Number two is that you want to be able to patch each of these computers. So that tells you that a distribution point or a software update point are mandatory roles within SCCM. And by the time we get to roles, we'll be talking more, about this, okay? So they get that information from there. The architecture is set up. They can communicate with the primary site server. A secondary site server does not necessarily need a kind of SQL server database. It can use what we call WID, which is called Windows Internal Database, which you can also refer to, as part of the configuration as a kind of an embedded SQL. You can also install what we regard as SQL Express to take care of it, which is, as good as that. And you have all these devices managed within that cadre. But now looked at it that, okay, the organization is making a lot of money. And we are now deciding to expand our offices to Europe. And we decide to have London office, which is now going to be taking care of all the other branch offices we'll be having, at within the Europe region. Now, they also have high numbers of users, say like 100,000 or 160,000. I cannot merge them into the primary site server anymore. Why? Because the primary site server already have maximum, can only support up to 150,000, which might be taken care of by, the contents that we have. Even though if it's not up to, probably you have 120,000 and you have another site that have 150,000 or 120,000. It's already more than the capacity of what the primary site can take. So which means that you have to set up a new primary site in London, okay, that takes care of all the computers within Europe. One thing is this: how exactly do you bring synergy into those computers in different regions? This is why you need a central administrative site. Now, all what I've been saying for the past 2 minutes is for you to understand the whole essence of each of these sites and how they interconnect with one another, and at what point do you need each one of them. So that is what we're saying when we're talking about the kind of design, because it's an hierarchy, hierarchy that exists. So it's a topology that tells you the mode of communication that exists within the business terrain or the business infrastructure. Now, never forget that the kind of businesses your organization run determines the kind of architecture that you set up, okay, that the organization is going to have to be able to manage its devices. And depending again with the organizational scope of work, because you cannot just decide on yourself and run different configuration, because it has to align with the business objectives, with the business goals of your organization. So that comes to the explanation regarding the kind of site servers, the kind of site that you can have within SCCM. I'll be opening the floor for a minute or two for questions, or if you need better understanding before we proceed into site roles that exist within SCCM. So the floor is open now for questions.
No question from my side.
Yeah, same here, no questions.
Thank you, Kanishika. Thank you, Tazin. Any other person, any question? Amiibo, any question? Rachel, any question? Okay, silence is golden. They're not saying anything. So since there is no question, we'll be moving into roles that exist within SCCM. I make mention to you guys, or I make you guys to understand that there are some set of roles that are mandatory within SCCM, and some are optional. And from all what we've discussed, you will realize that a distribution point, it's mandatory in SCCM. Even though we didn't really talk about it, but I make mention of a kind of a keyword that qualifies it when I said a data warehouse. We're going to be looking at what a management point is all about. So now what I will do is I'll give you a kind of a run through on the roles in SCCM, and I'll also be showing you where you can find each one of them after we discussed about all these roles. So you have, apart from having the knowledge, you know where it exists, and you know how to install each of these roles. So I'm going to be showing you all that, but we need to talk about the functionalities. What exactly does each of these roles symbolize? What exactly does it do? Why exactly do I need to have these roles in place before certain functionalities can come into being within the SCCM environment? We need to look at what kind of roles that come by default when you are installing your SCCM environment. One of the roles that come into existence, we'll be looking at your management point. You'll be looking at your distribution point, okay? You'll be looking at your fallback status point. But before we dangle into all that, let's talk about all the roles that exist within SCCM environments. One of the roles, like I mentioned, is what we call a management point. Another role is called a distribution point. The next one is we have software update point. We have what we refer to as a fallback status point. You have what we call application catalog website point. You have what we call application catalog web service point. You have what we call SMS provider. And we all know what SMS is all about. We talked about that yesterday, if you guys still remember, which is the system management server. We're going to be talking about assets intelligence synchronization point, what it does, does it exist, why do I need it within a corporate organization. We're going to be looking at endpoint protection point. And if you realize, we talked about endpoint protection where we're talking about the core features that exist within SCCM. We're going to be looking at reporting service points, which we also talked about briefly yesterday, about we creating a reporting within our SCCM environment. We will be looking finally as what regards to our state migration point. And I make mention of this as well to you guys yesterday when we were talking about the user state migration tool, which is always used to copy user settings when you're trying to migrate them from one operating system to the other, where you copy their favorites, their bookmark, literally, so by the time it is upgraded, they don't miss anything. It comes back and they don't have to start saving all their bookmarks or look for their favorite, so certain settings that exist within, that entity. Now that I've mentioned each of these roles, let's look at each one of them, one after the other, and look at what position or what role do they play in SCCM. Why exactly is this roles needed in SCCM? Okay, we'll be looking at each one of them. Now, a management point is a communication bridge between the SCCM server and its clients. Meaning that when I mean clients, I'm talking about nodes. And when I mean nodes, I'm talking about users. I'm talking about computers, devices, literally. Okay, it's like a mediator. That's what I used yesterday. It's like a mediator. It's a middleman. It's a communication bridge, which means that a computer cannot communicate directly to the primary site. They need to communicate through the management point, which is the reason why a management point is very important within the SCCM environment in your corporate entity. Now, a management point needs to come into existence. However, before I fully explain to you about all the functionalities that takes place within the management point, I will be talking about one of the roles we'll be talking about, which is called a fallback state point. Now, a fallback state point acts in the position of a management point if the management point is down. We'll go into that. I'm just chipping that in before we fully understand the functionalities or the role of a management point. Now, the management point is also, as much as it serves as a communication bridge between the SCCM and its client, it is also the point that allows all clients, when I mean clients, I mean all devices, to get policies, meaning that all devices get policies From where? From the management points. And we have a lot of policies, you know, within SCCM. We'll be looking at the hardware inventory policies, the software policies, machine policies. We're looking at application policies. We're looking at software update policies. You know, a lot of policies exist within the SCCM environment. And with the help of the management points, each of these clients are able to have all these policies all done. So it means that the policies run and they retrieve a lot of policies outside the policies which I've already mentioned, you know, within their own devices. So what I'm saying is that all operating systems they talk to the management point to be able to get what? To be able to get policies. Policies that exist within the SCCM primary site. Okay? Devices also upload all inventory data to the management point. Okay? I told you yesterday when I make mention of a client activities, I said, apart from the fact that you have SCCM clients installed on a machine, does not automatically says that it is active. You might have SCCM agents installed in the machine and it might not be active. It is not that they don't own that machine. But what always happens sometimes is because you always set up a time that you want each of your systems to be able to get policies, their policies run on their system, you know, using the client services that exist under the administration tab within the SCCM. When that machine is not available, when that policy is run, the system will not sense it that system has been on. That is why, you know, a lot of SCCM experts always have a kind of a partial scripting, like a kind of that checks the client's health on each of these machines, that triggers through a task scheduler on each of these machines and have the policy run immediately that machine come into existence. It is not all organizations that always have it done. Okay, it depends on how critical the environment is. It depends on how knowledgeable people managing the SCCM environment are for them to be able to understand that there can be remediation when it comes to SCCM agents within all the systems. Okay, so that is always being taken care of. It can be installed, you know, management points can be installed on your primary site. It can be installed on your secondary site, and you can have it installed on any Windows server. Not necessarily that it has to be on the primary site because it's a kind of a communication gap or a communication bridge between SCCM and its client. Does not necessarily mean that it has to be on the primary site. It can be on any site, on any server or any site, either primary, secondary, regardless. But wherever you put it, it's going to serve as a communication bridge with the main SCCM itself, where people can now be able to communicate. That is what a management point does. So if anybody should ask you of your knowledge or understanding about a management point, at the worst case scenario, in summary, you can be able to tell them that it's a communication gap, it's a communication bridge between the SCCM server and its clients, you know, that exist, either being a Windows 10 workstation, either a workstation or a server. And when I say workstation, I'm referring to as Windows 10, Windows 7, Windows Vista, Windows 8.1, and what have you on the client operating system. So when I talk server, I'm talking about site server operating system, you know, either Windows 2008 or Windows 2008 R2, or Windows 2012, Windows 2012 R2, or Windows Server 2016 or Windows Server 2019. Now, let's understand what is the function of a distribution point, which is also referred to as what we call a DP. Like I said, it is referred to as a data warehouse, which means that it's a content storage. Any application, any patches that needs to be installed on any machine has to go from the distribution point. A distribution point can be installed on your primary site server. You can have a site server or a secondary site server and you have it deployed there and you have the content. So, which means that if I build any system now or I build any server, any SCCM, and I need to communicate with other people, when I build that application, it is built within SCCM, but I need to distribute it to the data warehouse where every machine can be able to pick it up from. I can have as many distribution points as possible depending on the architecture that I have within my organization, depending on the corporate line of business. And why I say that is this: I have office in Europe, I have office in Americas, I have office in Africa. I don't want people in Africa to communicate directly, with Toronto to get content, because it will take time. Now you last start looking at latency. I want a situation whereby every offices I have in the African side, each of those offices have their own distribution point. So, which means that office in Nigeria does not need to download application or patches from office in Ghana. Same thing as office in India does not need to download content from office in Pakistan. Office in London, in Toronto, does not need to download any content from office in Edmonton. I want each of those IP subnets to be able to have their own data warehouse, which is easier for them to download content within their local area network, rather than going into the wide area network to download information. You will be putting into consideration what with regards to as your circuit. You don't want your circuit to be overloaded with lot of downloads or activities. You want only critical application to utilize your circuit, not content that can be downloaded at any point in time that can impact the activities that can be done within your organization within the business hour. Okay, now again, is that devices, like I've mentioned in all what I'm saying, download content from the distribution point. They don't download content from management point. A management point serves as another function entirely, as I've already mentioned, that it's just a communication bridge. It's not a data warehouse. It's not a content storage where information can be downloaded at any point in time. And this can be installed on either a primary site, a secondary site, or any other site. The next point we want to talk about is our software update point. Now, a software update point is required, to integrate what we call as WSUS, with in SCCM. You will remember when in our Windows Server class when we dealt with WSUS and we configured some patch activities. And I told you, I said SCCM is a beast. You have more control in terms of what kind of content. You have more control in terms of collections that you want to target. You can get more reporting as to what is happening to each of your systems, why it wasn't successful, and for those successful, you can check what that is installed on them without having to log into each of the systems to be able to check the content. Okay, what I'm saying is that WSUS itself is a tool that allows you to deploy patches within SCCM. That is now bringing into, what I'm saying, that without the software update point, you won't be able to integrate WSUS inside your SCCM environment. I do ask people within, when I interview them, and I say, tell me the difference between WSUS and SCCM. I want to know. If you tell me you've used SCCM, I want to know if you understand, because I understand that WSUS exists within SCCM and integration happens within software update point. I want you to be able to tell me, what are the limitations? What are the advantages that exist when you have SCCM, which has WSUS embedded? And when you talk about WSUS on the standalone, I want you to tell me about how it can be deployed. In SCCM, you can create your automatic deployment row, which is called your ADR, or you can do it manually, create collections, look at all the patches being downloaded from the Microsoft catalog, and you can have everything all done. So you must be able to, if you say you know SCCM, you should be able to say the difference. So I believe at this point, you guys know the difference, because we talked about and we configured WSUS as a standalone. And in SCCM, we're going to be having it all configured within the SCCM environment. And we look at how we can now look at the functionality of the integration on how devices can now be patched. Now, software update point is required to deploy software updates from SCCM to clients, like I've already mentioned. And let's look at the scenario in the whole essence. Content of what you're patching. I told you there are different kinds of patching. You have the third-party patching. You also have your Microsoft patching, okay? And I told you, I said there are some third-party patches or information catalogs that can be obtained from through Microsoft. And when we're talking about Adobe. Now, Microsoft has its own update server. The WSUS that you see that we configured as a standalone, even through SCCM, communicate directly with this server to get, release from Microsoft that is released, every second Tuesday of the month. But one thing is that Microsoft release catalog every day, and that's why organizations have a synchronization set up for every day to get the latest catalog from Microsoft, even though the patches are released in the second Tuesday of every month. Now, before it gets to SCCM, the software update point will now integrate the content that has been downloaded by this WSUS from the Windows update server, and now put everything integrated with SCCM, which means, in all essence, that the software update point remain the front end while WSUS is the back end, because you don't see the WSUS in action unless you open it. But it is the one that automatically synchronizes with the Windows update server to get all the updates released by Microsoft. And I also mentioned when I talked about the solutions like Avanti and Qualys, what they do as well. I said they always have a kind of a server within your office premises, and they have a cloud configuration within their own DMZ zone, where every computer does not need to be on the VPN before they get patched. Now, they communicate because of the agent that has been installed. And some of this solution comes with either agent or agentless. So even when there's no agent on those machines, because they have the details of that machine, they can still communicate with those machines. And they get their content directly. So what it does is that, depending on the level of severity, they first check the on-prem server. If they realize that there's no patch relating to that, they communicate, with the cloud to look at third-party servers and see if they could get that content and have that system patched. Now, for your system to be protected, and I told you, I said, because of vulnerabilities and all the security issues is the reason why security is number one in every business organization. Whatsoever you have to ensure that you make security the number one. When you're security conscious, your office perimeters or your office terrain is safe. If there's any laxity within your own activities, and your activities or your credentials is compromised, then the office will also be compromised. Because anybody that have access to your credentials, or because you make your system vulnerable, you already make the entire environment vulnerable. That is the reason why there's always endpoint, management or protection at any point in time, and organizations must have the right to be able to check every activities going on within their corporate entity and to see how they can protect this environment from being vulnerable. Okay, because you download patches from Microsoft or third party does not mean that your system cannot be vulnerable. I have seen times without numbers where Microsoft release patches and these patches have issues and they have to roll it back themselves. Sometimes they have issues and they have to create immediate superseding patches without waiting for the patch the second Tuesday of the month to release that patches. That is why it is very important as an SCCM expert or as an SCCM specialist to ensure that before you push any patches into your production environment, you have it tested within your test environment. When you test within your test environment, you want to test within your development environment, which has a kind of a prototype of what you have within your production environment. If it fails at that point, you will not release it to your environment. Sometimes when it fails, does not mean that that same patch had issue. Now, your organization might be running what we call legacy applications that does not require the patches that is released by Microsoft or any third-party application. So you want to ensure that you have a test of this. And I told you guys, I said, if you're going to be working as a patch manager, you need to understand the procedures to do a rollback just in case there's a failure at any point in time while you are deploying, your patches. If you don't know how to roll back and you have thousands of machines, then you're going to be considering yourself getting sacked, because lack of due diligence can cost the organization lots of profit, per second or per minute or per day. And you want to ensure that you have all these things tested, which is the reason why you're employed, to ensure that all these things are well taken care of before being released into the sensitive production environment. Now, we've talked about a management point. We've talked about a distribution point. We've talked about software update point. Then now we have to look at a fallback status point. If you remember, we're going to be using as an analogy when we were doing the Active Directory class and when we configured our DNS. I told you that there's a need for us to create what we call a fault tolerance by creating a replication, by having a secondary what? A DNS. Just in case our primary DNS fails, our secondary DNS will still be working while that is coming up. I also refer to, in one of our previous classes, the importance of having a RAID configuration within your virtualized environment. All these things is when you're now talking about fault tolerance to ensure that, when one service is down, the other service take control, which was the reason why I make mention when I was talking about the management point, and I talked about what we call a fallback status point. I told you, I said, if the management point which serves as the communication gap between the SCCM environment and the client is not available, the client needs to communicate with someone to get the policies. If a system in London, Ontario, needs to get content from its own secondary site or its site server, and the distribution point is not available, there must be a fallback status point that could redirect them to the available distribution point for them to get their content, which means that a fallback status point is the one creating the fault domain that allows devices within a different subnet to be able to communicate with another distribution point within another subnet and have the content so far they're within the same umbrella. When I mean the same umbrella, I mean within the same organization. Now, a fallback status point is a role used to receive what we call a status message from clients when what management point is down, which is the same thing as what I've already mentioned earlier. Now, when something goes wrong, and this I'm doing a recap as well, when something goes wrong with your management point, devices will communicate with other sites. How are they able to communicate with other sites? It is with the help of a fallback status point. Why they're able to do that? That comes out in interviews and also in exams as well. A fallback plan, like I said, if a fallback status point can act as a management point when the management point itself is down. Okay, and other advantages or other functionalities is that clients can use a fallback status point to download content from a different distribution point. I mentioned this few seconds or few minutes ago. So sometimes I do a recap as well. So that is what it does. It has that great functionality, and it can also be installed either on your primary site or secondary site or any Windows server, and you can have it all deployed in, and that is what it does. Okay. Now I'll be talking about what we call the application catalog website point. Why it is optional. This is optional now. All what I mentioned, the management point, distribution point, software update point, fallback, status point are all mandatory. But when we're talking about optionals, we'll be looking at something like application catalog website point. What does this do? I told you guys yesterday about software updates and say the software center that you can either request for software to be installed on your machine through it, or software can be installed and you keep log of all the softwares that is installed on your machine and also the one available, and you also use it for upgrading your operating system through task sequence, and you can also use it for installing patches. However, application catalog points is different, and Fazel, you will remember in one of the organizations that we both work, whereby when a user needs a software, it is not available at their software center, but there's a URL you can go where you can type in the host name of that computer that you want to install a software on. It will tell you all the software installed on that machine, and you can install a required software by that client directly from there without having to start distributing or adding that machine to a collection. Now, this is what always happens if you need to deploy a machine, a application to a machine. If you have a collection, probably for a specific users, and Kanishika says, hi IT, I need to have VLC player installed, and his machine is not part of that collection. You have to add that machine to that collection that the software is deployed to so that he can get it. Now, you don't want to bug your SCCM engineer to always add those machines. Now, with the help of the application catalog website point, you can just click add the machines and install that software. It will automatically add them to the container and have it installed automatically on that machine. So which means that it is required to create internal app store as a self-portal for users, meaning that users can do it themselves, and also IT expert, SCCM engineers can use that as a means to install application for users without having to go back to the SCCM engineer that deployed the application in the first instance when it was created. Now, this can be installed on any server. You can install your application catalog website point on any server, okay? And you can create a website, and it would act as an app store, meaning that I have all the apps, I create a kind of interface just like what I've discussed to ask all those applications. And this is an example of what you see when you go to either your Android store or you go to your Apple store. That store already has all the applications that is made available by developers. You now have to go there and install. So it's just a typical analogy, a kind of explanation on how it works. So an application catalog website point is just like your Apple store or Android store. That gives you a better explanation. But when this website is created that has this application, how does it get information about either users or devices to have this software installed on? This is where you need SCCM. However, when SCCM is in play, does not mean that SCCM have a direct relationship with this website point that you've created. You now need another role, which is called Application Catalog Web Service Point. Now, Application Web Service Point is a role that is used to publish to users so that they can have access to the applications created under the Application Catalog website point. Listen, I said we have the Application Catalog website point, which is what? An app store that have what? Application that you want to make available to users. Now, Application Catalog Web Service Point is the one that now serves as a communication bridge between the Application Catalog website point and SCCM, so that application created under the Application Catalog website point can be published to users so that they can have access to all these applications. Okay, so that's the difference. I try as much as possible to break it down for you. One is the communication bridge, one is the application itself. The communication bridge ensures that the website point is integrated with SCCM, and the users can have access to those applications that have been made public. Now, I'll be talking about what with regards to as SMS Provider. You all know what SMS is all about. It is called a System Management Server, which is the first name assigned to SCCM in 1994 when it came out, when we have the SCCM 1.0, 1.1, and 2.0, as I mentioned earlier, I mentioned yesterday during the introduction. Now, the SMS Provider is a WIM provider. And when I say WIM, I need WMI, and we all know what WIM is all about. It is Windows Management Instrumentation. Provider that assign a read and write to the configuration manager database. Okay, it also converts a WIM query into SCCM query so that it can be fed or feed into the database, because SQL database understands the language SQL. SCCM uses what we call WIMP query, which is called WQL. Okay. Now, WQL query cannot feed into a SQL query. They're different. But it is the function of the SMS provider to convert the WQL query into a SQL query that is stored into the database that is associated with your primary site server. Okay, so which means that the SMS is serving as a postman between the SCCM and its database. Okay, so that is what that does. The next thing we want to talk about is to talk about what we call access intelligence synchronization point. Now, like I told you earlier, once we talk about this, I will go and show you within the SCCM environment where all these roles exist and how you can install it just in case you've not have it installed. Now, the asset intelligence synchronization point is required to categorize softwares within your SCCM, and this can be found under asset and compliance. I believe that you still remember the tabs in SCCM where we have the asset and compliance, we have the software library, you have the monitor, and you have the administration. Now, under your asset and compliance is where you have your asset intelligence synchronization, where, this role for the point allows you to be able to categorize all the softwares that exist within your SCCM environment. Now, what it does literally is that it does inventory and it manages software licensing within your computer. Okay, that is what it does. So it allows you to be able to have all those things under control. Yeah, to allow you to have under control. So what I'm saying is that I have a lot of software. Taking an example, I have something like Google Chrome, I have Firefox, I have Safari, I have Internet Explorer, I have Opera, I have Media Player, VLC. Now, if he wants to categorize it, he's going to categorize in browser. Under browser, what do we have? He's going to merge all the Google Chrome, all the Firefox, Safari, Internet Explorer, and merge them under what we call he's going to merge them under under the category, okay, and categorize them like that, and it allows you to easily manage what you have within your environment. Okay, now there are 3 more roles that we need to talk about. One of them is what we call endpoint protection. I told you guys yesterday that endpoint protection is part of the core features of SCCM. And what it does is that it allows a configuration manager to manage the Windows firewall settings in the configuration manager console. You can also configure anti-malware policies and apply that to selected group of computers by using a custom anti-malware policies, and client settings within your SCCM environment. Now, another roles we're looking at is to look at our report services point. Now, our report services point, as I make mention of yesterday, is that it allows SCCM to communicate with what we call SSRS, which is called a SQL Server Reporting Services, to copy SCCM reports to a specific report folder. Then SCCM will configure a report service general and security settings. Okay, these in all essence allow SCCM to be connected to its site database so that it can be able to retrieve data that is required when reports are run. That's what it does. And the last one we'll be talking about in terms of the roles is what we call as the state migration point. I told you that a state migration point is used for what? A user state migration tool, whereby a user state data when a computer is being migrated from one operating system to the other, it's going to copy what is in that computer in terms of settings, so that by the time it's upgraded, users don't lose all the settings which they have in existence. So this comes into the end of when we're talking about the site and the site roles that exist within SCCM. So I'm going to create I'm going to open the floor for a minute or two before we bring that section to an end, and we have a break, and we'll come back and talk about logs in SCCM. So the floor is open now for questions.
Right, no questions from me.
Okay, President, thank you. Any other person, any question?
No question for me.
Thank you, Kanishika. Kaude, Patrick, Big, Fazel, Usna, Amiable, Richard, any question?
No question for me so far. It's good.
Okay, it means that you guys understand. So we're going to take a 15 minutes break as usual. Then we come back exactly. Okay, let's see. Okay, let's come back 4:10. Then we're going to continue another section on the SCCM log. Okay. 4:10, please be prompt. We'll start immediately by 4:10. Thank you, guys. I'm going to stop recording now.